Welcome everyone, today is Wednesday, apparently that is also the reset day for EU, not just for NA, coming a few hours later than NA, and we have things to talk about. Starting for example, the fact that with this reset we have gotten some balance changes, both to the dungeons, some nerfs to some dungeons, but also to some of the specs, which continue to be tuned. Now, admittedly, we might have expected a few more balance changes for specs. There aren't really that many. We are talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-ish specs being changed. So we were expecting a few more, to be honest, as well as some dungeon changes, this time mostly positive. So we're starting with the specs. Death Knight receives nothing, minor change to Rider of the Apocalypse. This is a surprise given the current power of Death Knight. These are the current results in Mythic raiding after the first full reset, and you have not one but two different specs doing very well. Worth pointing out still that in popularity, the vast majority of the players are still playing Frost, and Unholy is nowhere near that level of popularity, but it is still doing well nonetheless. If we jump into Mythic Plus, it is, this time, much more large, the difference between Frost and Unholy, and even if we start looking at the first of the high keys of the season, we do see a lot of presence of Frost DK as well, but they go by and slip past any of the nerfs. We do start getting more changes with Druid, in particular, no, not Balance. Balance has been buffed last week, and not even with Feral, which received a decent QOL related to their AoE damage, their splash AoE damage, but they would need far more to become more relevant when it comes to AoE and when it comes to Mythic Plus. The change for Druid this time is for Resto, which is buffed again. Resto was buffed by 8%, and then this week is being buffed by 4% again. Obviously, we can see why. Currently, the power of Restoration Druid in the raid is quite bad. They don't do much. We mentioned they had two possible viable builds in the raid, the consistent healing and spot healing with Regrowth, and Reju playing double Life Bloom instead of playing with Flourish. But at the moment, the performance with that build is even weaker than the one they currently have, and they have had for a long time, which is ramping up with Flourish. But even that one, even the old build of Resto Druid is doing terribly, so they do get another 4% healing buff. Admittedly, this is not nearly as necessary, as Resto Druid is not nearly as weak in Mythic Plus, even if you start going into the tougher level keys. Resto Druid is not, particularly worse than many of the other specs besides the outlier of Restoration Shaman. So it is a buff for Resto Druid and also more focused on the raid when it comes to being buffed. The other one is a buff to another spec, another AoE buff. This time is to Beast Mastery Hunter, which gets their Beast Cleave and Kill Cleave damage increase from 80% damage to 90% damage. Now, you might have noticed this yourself, of course, when it comes to Mythic Plus. There is a decent popularity of Hunters. We're not talking about very super high keys, but 10 plus. 10 plus is good difficulty right now, and this one is a decent amount of popularity for Hunter. However, this is not Beast Mastery, it's Marksmanship. At the moment, the AoE damage of Beast Mastery is suffering quite a lot. They have some issues in doing AoE damage. They are particularly bottlenecked by this particular set of 2-point talents, Basilisk Collar. The stacking damage over time effects on enemies, getting your pets to do 10% more damage, becomes almost unbalanceable on multiple targets, the amount of stacking damage this would have on AoE, and the power this gives Beast Mastery Hunter in single target. It's very hard to translate this into being balanced in Mythic Plus. So the result is that when you look at the DPS in Mythic Plus, Beast Mastery is having problems in AoE. In single target, they are not weak. In single target, Beast Mastery is holding their own. You wouldn't call them one of the strongest specs in the game, but they are, they are okay. However, not in AoE, and of course also this buff is far too small to actually change anything when it comes to Beast Mastery Hunter. They would have better luck actually balancing this one to have a stack limit or a cap limit on multiple targets and make it more easily applicable on multiple targets without becoming this much of a problem in AoE as it currently is. Now, buff number 74 to Fire Mage. This time the buff to Fire Mage is to their AoE damage. Now, you would be surprised because if you go back to the raid performance, at the moment Fire is doing just fine. If we start from the first boss, Olgrax, Fire isn't doing particularly well. Yeah, of course, they have some outliers, but there is a lot of padding in here. There is a lot of add damage in the intermissions of Olgrach. So if you move back to single target damage, still Fire is not doing great. You move over to the Bloodbound Horror. Fire Mage is doing significantly better in terms of both the boss damage that Fire Mage is doing, but even, the entire fight of the Bloodbound Horror. Good benchmark. Sikran is a good single target patchwork fight this tier to see the specs single target damage potentials. Fire Mage is also doing very well. They're not having too many problems dishing out a lot of single target damage at the moment. When it comes to AoE though, you would look at the results in Mythic Plus of the last week, the first week of the season. Fire Mage was doing absolutely terribly. Don't look too much at week 2, right? The numbers, you literally have like 50 people for some specs. It's just the first day basically. So this is not really that relevant. It's more relevant the numbers of week 1, several thousand logs. Fire Mage was terrible. If you look at the current popularity, actually, if you go across all of the specs, the smallest number of popularity is, I guess, 0.3 of Sub Rogue and then 0.3 of Fire Mage. They are basically there to be the least played when it comes to DPS as a whole, and definitely the least played of range DPS. So the buff to Fire actually is to their AoE tools. So we are talking about Flame Strike, we are talking about Phoenix Flames, and for the 15th time we are talking about Living Bomb. So again, the entire right side of the tree of Fire, which focuses around Living Bomb, around Late Fuse, around spreading and doubling and duplicating Living Bombs, is buffed again. And for the moment, again, Fire Mages are not playing down this side. And even if you go now, this week, post changes to see the results of Fire Mages in keys, granted it's even hard to find all top logs with 10 keys because of how little Fire Mage is being played. But even if you look at some of these good results, the Fire Mage is, it's not looking too good. They are actually trying, at the very least, to play around Flame Strike this time around after the Flame Strike buffs, but despite playing with Flame Strike, they're still not playing down the right side of the tree, focusing around Living Bomb. Now, an interesting change this time, again for Mage. Of course, Mage is Blizzard's poster children, so Frost also gets buffed. They get a 20% more damage to Glacial Spike and a 15% more damage to Ray of Frost. Now, we mentioned the bad performance of Fire last week. It's not that Frost was doing that much better. Granted, in terms of popularity, it was definitely doing better. Yes, it looks bad just because Arcane is here, but a 6.5% would put you at a decent average with the other ranged specs. And also, not to point out the thing, right now, when it comes to the absolutely highest keys at the moment, a lot of the results are with Frost, not with Arcane Mage. The biggest difference though was definitely coming in single target, in bosses, in raids, where Frost was losing out to multiple other specs, including by quite a bit to the other two Mage specs. So obviously getting buffed in Glacial Spike and also in Ray of Frost for a Frost Mage is more centered around their single target power more so than their AoE power, especially trying to get players to actually play Ray of Frost. Whether you are in Mythic Plus or you are in the raid, you kind of have to use this talent to actually benefit from this talent being buffed in the first place. The last of the buffs for this reset has gone to Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest gets a 4% damage buff across the board, so just another blanket buff given to Shadow Priest. Now, talking about underperforming specs, even if we move back to all bosses, Shadow Priest would definitely fit into this category. They have, as we just shown, just slightly better results when it comes to single target compared to all boss damage, but it's still bad. We're still talking about bad results. When it comes to Mythic Plus, they are again in this averageness level. You know, you definitely are not going to see that many Shadow Priests at high level right now in terms of Mythic plus keys. Even if you look at the actual DPS damage in week 1, we mentioned about the badness of Fire, which was buffed, the badness of Frost, which was buffed, the badness of Beastmaster, which was buffed, and then you also have Shadow Priest being buffed. So it's a pretty simple explanation. They are doing little damage in both single target and AoE, which is why they get buffed, not in a specific ability for a specific damage profile like BM being buffed in AoE, or Frost being buffed more in single target, or Fire Mage being buffed more in AoE. They just get a blanket buff. We are, however, not talking anymore about blanket buffs. Instead, now we are talking about blanket nerfs, because it's time to talk about dungeons which get nerfed. And the biggest, baddest, largest of the nerfs goes to Siege of Borvalus. At the moment, in the Dungeons Ease tier list, according to WoW Meta, we can switch from WoW Meta into Archon to see what they think about the difficulty of dungeons. There is a slight difference of opinion. Siege of Borvalus is apparently easier than Grim Battle and Stonevault, according to Archon, whereas in this case, Siege is the worst of the dungeons. This is based on the max level key together with the max score achieved in those keys, as well as the variance in keys done in the different dungeons. Siege of Borvalus is at the moment the worst of all of them, right close, right next to Grim Battle. So the blanket set of nerfs includes pretty much nerfing the HP of most of the enemies in Siege of Borvalus. We are talking about the Iron Tide Raider, the Bildrat Buccaneer, the Iron Tide Wave Shaper, the Sniper. All of their health gets reduced by 10 to 20%. So just speeding up the trash of Siege of Borvalus. Things get better because, you know, lowering the HP can be felt, you know, finishing a pack 2-3 seconds faster, but what will be felt even more is finally slowing down some of the cast cooldowns of these mobs, like the Bildrat Tempest Choking Waters, which gets spammed non-stop, has its cast time increased. You have the Iron Tide Raiders Iron Hook ability cooldown increase. I think it's a 50% longer cooldown, so the super annoying constant pull in on this mob gets reduced, as well as, very big change, the Bilge Rat Demolisher, so the giant troll doing the mega AoE smash, actually now does 40% less damage. That's a big number, 40% less damage. This pretty much means now you can, I mean, not safely, but you can now pull at least 2 of them at once, for example, without being it nearly as dangerous. The only caveat, on top of also having their health nerfed by 10%, now though it ignores armor. So it's not a physical damage effect reduced in damage by, for example, being a plate user having high armor, for example. Now the damage is more normalized across all specs. It is still a massively good change. Not that massive, 5% HP nerf to the third boss of Siege of Borvalus. Where we have more massive changes is in the last boss of Siege. Very annoying, the double magic debuff, which makes it very easy if you have, for example, a warlock with an imp able to double dispel, for example. Now that is still going to be here. However, now finally the Demolishing Terror Slam damage now ignores armor, just like the big crash of the Demolisher, but it no longer knocks you back. There is no more knockback in this fight. One of the more dangerous parts of the mechanic of the entire fight was getting knockbacked into the swirlies, into a one-shot. In some cases, even getting knockbacked as you are dispelled, you get next to another player, you knock the player away, or getting knocked back into the water, etc, etc. That was the main difficulty of the fight, which would ramp up, of course, because every platform, the space becomes smaller and smaller, so it becomes harder to dodge the swirlies while trying not to get knocked back, etc, etc. Now, all of this is gone. So it's a very significant nerf to the last boss of Siege. We had a minor QOL improvement on the Mist Color, improving the visibility of the Vulpin summoned by Freeze tag in Mist of Ternaseath, as well as more improvements to the visibility of the last boss of Grim Battle, Aerodax, also known as purple. Everything in that fight is just dark purple. The boss is purple, the tentacles that spawn are purple, the circle that you have to get into, everything outside of it is purple, the circles that you get when you are inside the circle are also purple, and you can't see shit. Now, the visual scale of Erudux has been reduced. Players who get affected by Death's Grasp, you now have a brief immunity to the Void Tendrils when it expires, and also improve the visibility of the tendrils themselves. Now they have a red outline around them, so it's easier to see the tentacles. But that's not just all that happens to Green Battle, you also have actual visible nerfs, because the Twilight Warlock's enveloping Shadow Flame, which is the big healing absorb shield they used to cast 2 at once, now they only cast 1 at a time. So now this turns into a rather simple and irrelevant healer mechanic, where you get the curse and you decurse it. That's it. It's over. If you have a mage in your group, a druid in your group, they can also decurse, and it's over. You no longer have this 4, 5, 6 million HP absorb shield, which can become very difficult if you go into bigger pools with more damage, and some players have this huge absorb shield on top of them. There is also a nerf to the smallies before the last boss, the one that gives you stacking shadow damage taken increase. 5% per stack has now been reduced to 3% per stack, so now it's easier to survive the targeted dot damage of the big guys, as well as those big guys, the faceless corruptors that do the corrupt cast, the single target focused dot damage. Now it has a longer cast time before it actually happens, and it does 10% less damage. So not just the damage of the ability itself is being nerfed, also the debuff you get by killing the smallies, which make you take even more damage from that cast. To finish, a couple of sanity checks, a couple of good nerfs to the Stone Vault. These were not like game breakers, they weren't like group wipers, but it's good to have these slightly nerfed. Number 1, you have the Molten Metal cast, which is now increased to 3 seconds instead of 2. And then you also have the damage from the Silence Speaker now doing damage, ticking damage every 3 seconds instead of every 1.5 seconds. So as I said, not like major changes, but it's good during those corridors of trash mobs with these mobs spamming these things multiple times, making them easier to interrupt. So overall, in terms of dungeons being nerfed, in terms of quantity, you have Siege and Grim Battle being targeted the most. And if you go and look at the what our collection of data has shown, they did put, in fact, Grim Battle and Siege as 2 of the hardest dungeons. So it's good, I guess, that they have both been nerfed, in particular Siege of Boralus. But for this reset, at least, these were all of the changes planned. You have some, as mentioned, some spec changes, not major, most of them, as well as some dungeon changes, some of these being quite more significant, in particular Siege, and then slightly less Grim Battle. So these were the updates to this reset's changes to the season. With this being done, it is now time to leave each other, as well as go back to streaming, which was interrupted just to push out this video. So with this being said, we can now leave each other, even if temporarily, if you want to tune on the stream after this. With this out of the way now, for everyone who won't, we are now saying goodbye to each other. Thanks, of course, as usual, for watching the video, as well as for supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys possibly later tonight or tomorrow. And in the meantime, yeah, I was expecting some more balancing, to be fair. You know, a few more of the weak specs, a couple of nerfs to the best specs. Maybe next week.